Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Cockpit Counsel. My name is Tim. I'm the Chief Legal Officer at LinkSquares, and today I've got with me one of the leading minds in the AI space, Rob May. Rob has held a number of executive positions at a handful of different companies. I'll let him get into it. I wouldn't come close to doing it justice. But before we get started, we ask all of our guests, Rob, do you have a pre-flight ritual?
I do, and it's a ritual that other people who fly with me hate, which is I always check my bag. It doesn't matter if I'm going one night over whatever. It's like people are like, "You're nuts," and I've never lost my suitcase. I fly, 40 times a year for last 15 years, and but the reason I do it is I have an explorer personality. I like to explore airports. I walk around a lot, particularly if you get through security fast and you're there, and so it's really nice to go without dragging your luggage around. So yeah, it's kind of unusual, but that's what I do.
That's absolutely unusual. You're the first person that I've met who's just been like, I check all the time, right? I appreciate it. I tend to be more along the lines of I don't know if I'll have enough time to both check my bag and make my flight, right? So I usually just exit that step and carry on whenever I possibly can. So awesome. Well, Rob, tell us a little bit about yourself and the somewhat long and winding road that got you involved in LinkSquares. I know you're obviously real close with the team here, and would love to just see how the journey brought you to where you are today.
Yeah, so I went to University of Kentucky, so go Wildcats. I'm a huge college basketball fan, and got an electrical engineering degree and an MBA, and I went to work for a company called Harris. So I'm a computer chip designer training. That's where I got my start. When I was down in Florida working for them, I started a master's degree in computer science focused on artificial intelligence. And I dropped out halfway through the program because this was, I don't know, 2005 maybe, and it was AI was like symbolic logic programming in Lisp, which if you don't know anything about AI technology, that is not what AI is today at all. And I remember thinking like, this is useless. So I went to work for a couple of startups after that. I moved from engineering into sales, engineering and business development, and learned a lot about contracts, negotiation, and all that. And then I started a company called Backupify that did backup for cloud computing applications. We'll talk about this in a minute, but that's where Vishal and Chris both worked for me at Backupify, the founders of LinkSquares, as did a lot of the team that's there now. A lot of the executives came up through Backupify. That was a great company. We had a great run. We sold the company to Datto in 2014. Datto, so I went to work at Datto for a year. Subsequently, they IPO'd, and our product was doing, I don't know, 10 or 15 times the revenue. It was doing over $100 million in revenue for them. We probably should have held on to it longer. And then, then I started angel investing with a heavy focus on AI in 2015, and started another company called Tala. Did customer support chatbots. Tala sort of went sideways. Just wasn't really the home run that I was hoping for. So we merged that in with another company, and then I became a full-time venture capitalist to join a firm called PJC as a partner. And at PJC, I led all their AI and robotics investing for a couple of years. And then we seeded a company called Dianthus that I run now as the chief technology officer and founder. It was my idea, and brought it to the team and said we should do this. Dianthus builds machine learning software for e-commerce applications, but we don't sell it to anybody. We acquire e-commerce companies in, and we use it to grow them faster and run them better. Vishal and Chris from LinkSquares are actually both investors now in my company. And yeah, it was just such an attractive opportunity. I had to leave the VC gig and come do it full time. So I'm back on the operating side now, which is, man, some days I regret it, but it's pretty fun overall,
Yeah, that's awesome. How have you seen obviously there's very clear differences in roles from being an operator versus being an investor. What have you been able to bring with you now as an operator after sitting on that investment side? Like, what are maybe 2 or 3 things that maybe somebody who's never worked in that space would be like, wow, that's weird, I never thought about that.
A lot of people don't understand the game theory of venture capital. So sometimes people don't want to raise a lot of money, but you've probably heard the saying that like if you owe the bank $100,000, it's your problem, but if you owe the bank $100 million, it's the bank's problem.
Right.
And venture capital is a similar way. It's like if you don't raise a lot of capital, nobody cares if you go under. If you raise so much capital and you're burning so much that like you sort of stay, they can't keep you alive in a bad situation. But if you're like burn to capital raised ratio is good, you end up in this situation where they feel like, for a couple $1 million they can keep you alive. Like venture capitalists will totally do it. So when you've been a venture capitalist and you can incorporate how VCs think into how you operate a company and how you go fundraise, it's pretty interesting. And I definitely think investing makes you a better operator, and operating definitely makes you a better investor. In a lot of ways. Vishal and I have talked a lot about this stuff over the years. But it's funny because I do want to be, one of the really interesting things is like LinkSquares has gone far beyond where Backup If I ever went when those guys worked for me. And it's taken a lot of interesting turns and pivots. When they first came to me, Chris, about a year after we got acquired, Chris and Vishal came to me and said, we're going to start this company, and it was not anything of what LinkSquares is today. And I actually told them, I was like, guys, this is a really dumb idea. But because you both used to work for me, I'm going to give you some money. So I was a very early investor in LinkSquares, and now it's my second best investment of all time, and I'm invested in 110 companies. So that tells you how well it's doing, and it's just been really, really impressive to watch the company grow and watch how Vishal and Chris have really navigated things. So anyway, a little bit of a detour there, sorry, but that's how I'm connected to LinkSquares.
One quick question on that. What do we need to do to be your best investment? Just so I can take notes here and make sure it happens.
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, we'll have to see. I mean, my best investment, I think, has $10 billion potential. So
okay.
It's a computer chip investment. I think it'd be good. So you guys got an IPO.
All right. Well, we'll see. I like the $10 billion goal post. I think that's a good one for us to strive to.
Yeah.
At least that's a good start, right? Awesome. So let's turn directly into the AI. You are a thought leader in the space. You've been in the space for a long time. Tell us, what is the state of AI right now? What are some trends that you're seeing? And for folks who maybe don't know a ton, obviously most of our audience is lawyers. I imagine some maybe have a very surface level understanding of AI and sort of what goes into that, creating that artificial intelligence. Maybe just a couple minutes on a crash course. When you talk about AI, what do you really mean? And then how do you see things evolving and where the space is going?
Yeah, well, the thing that I'll point out, because a lot of people will say, a lot of companies will position themselves as AI companies, and people will just say, well, they're using some 30-year-old statistical techniques. That's not really AI. In some cases, it actually is. So if you don't know a lot about neural networks, which have driven the modern version of AI, what I would say since 2015, neural networks actually have been around for 30 or 40 years. We just never had enough data and compute power to make them work effectively. So that's what's driven this latest wave. Now, there are other ways to do AI. So you don't need neural networks. There are Bayesian approaches, there's symbolic logic processing, there's what they call evolutionary algorithms. So there's a bunch of AI technologies that aren't popular right now that are starting to resurge given the popularity in AI, or neural network AI, I should say. But the way I typically define it is software that you can put out into the world, and without you changing anything, it will adapt and learn and get better. So most AI companies are running some kinds of machine learning models, and what those models do is they take in a bunch of new data every day, and then they retrain themselves at night, and then they run again on the software the next day. So a legal example in like the natural language processing space is you're trying to figure out, again, you've got 100,000 contracts, and you're trying to figure out like where are the indemnification clauses in all my contracts, and they're dozens or hundreds of pages, and you don't want to read through all of them. And sometimes you can't always do a basic text search because people use different words and phrasing for things. Natural language processing based machine learning models can sort of analyze stuff and say, I know these didn't use the exact same words, but they roughly mean the same thing. So you can pull those things out. So I think that's a really really interesting type of application for AI. And then, you know, the other thing that I would explain to like lawyers and people, when AI is simultaneously like overhyped, underhyped. It's really weird as a technology. The whole like artificial general intelligence killer robots thing is way overhyped. Like I see no evidence that we are on the track for that anytime soon. And I'm on the cutting edge of investing in this stuff. We're a long way from that. But the flip side is it's very underapplied in most organizations, and it's underapplied for two reasons. Number one, people don't know what to do with it a lot of times. And number two, when you first put it out there, it very often, almost always underperforms the humans initially. And people don't want to give it the time to learn and get better. So when you're dealing with a machine learning model, it's like hiring a new employee. You know, they come in and first you want to look over their work, and then you want to say, oh, this is good, this is bad, do more like this. And then they can go run on their own. And a lot of machine learning software gets deployed that way. And it's part of the reason that sometimes these machine learning driven investments, they lag what a normal SaaS company would do, because SaaS is just super fast, you know, sign up and get going. Sometimes training on data and getting to learn what you need is a little bit slower. The one piece of feedback that I would give you and the listeners on where to look to apply AI is I got asked in 2017 to do a talk on like where should you look, and so I came up with this framework that I call the PAC framework, PAC, and it stands for predict, automate, and classify. And those are the three common things that you can do with AI. You can use it to predict things better than a human can, or more efficiently than a human can. You can use it to automate things that you used to have to do, or you can use it to classify things into certain buckets, right? It's just a picture of a dog or a cat, or you know, whatever it is. Right. And so the way that I have always advised people to do it is I would take each department of your business and I would, you know, make 3 columns. What could we predict about in this department that would help us run the business better? What could we automate that would help us run the business better? What could we classify that might help us run the business better? And then I would go through and I would see, like, you know, you're going to have buckets of things, and some things are going to be feasible and some aren't. And I would, you know, take those to your data science team and figure out the 2 or 3 that you could pick off and actually work on, given the fact that you need a lot of data to make it work, and you know, you need some time and some patience.
Yeah, absolutely. So getting back to maybe just the very beginning, talking about AI and how, you know, you said during the day it goes out and does things, and then at night it learns. How do you verify the integrity of what it's learning, right? Like, how do you make sure that the AI that you're building / developing, growing, is getting the right input to, like, getting correct data, right? As opposed to drawing conclusions on things that are, you know, maybe not what you would intend them to be.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm sure one that keeps many lawyers up at night, because depending on the AI techniques that you use, some of them are what we call explainable, meaning that you can inspect the machine learning model and figure out why it gave the output that it gave. And other times, like most neural networks are not explainable, meaning that you don't understand why it gave the output it gave, because if you open it up, it's a bunch of nodes, and each node has a weight like 0.3, 0.28, and you don't know what those nodes mean. Okay. So it causes a lot of problems sometimes, and it's part of the reason that AI is underapplied in areas where you know, you might get in trouble for gender discrimination, racial discrimination, you know, because even if you, like, let's say you don't even put race into a machine learning model as an input, it could still pick up on secondary factors that correlate with race, and it could learn to discriminate. So, and it would be hard to figure out from the model that that's what's going on. So you have to be really careful. There's an emerging suite of tools that help you monitor and do this, because it's also harder to test, because you have to figure out, like, you know, in normal software, you have what's called regression testing, which are like, here's the 100 tasks the software has to do. We made some changes. Does it still do the 100 tasks the same way? You know, machine learning models are trying to change and get better and give you better answers. So you can test them with regression techniques, but they may not be as complete as they were for other software. So it's definitely creating a little bit of open-endedness that makes people uncomfortable sometimes. But you know, you can incorporate best practices. I mean, the best thing to do is make the people that are working on AI aware of these potentials, So they're on the lookout for it, and they're thinking about it every step. They're looking at the data, they're analyzing the, making sure the data is clean and structured and looks good. They're thinking about the way the models are built, and they're supervising the output and regularly testing that. So that would be my advice to everybody.
It makes a ton of sense. And so when you think about, and you also mentioned sort of AI being both sort of overestimated in terms of its capabilities and underestimated in terms of its capabilities or usefulness. Let's dig into that a little bit more, you know, and more or less in the context of how useful AI can be today, and maybe what are some obvious next steps that you see people are, whether it's in talking to folks who you may be looking at for investment purposes, or even just within, you know, within your own organization, to the extent that you feel comfortable, you know, disclosing some of the secret sauce, so to speak. But really would love to get your thoughts on where we're going and how we should be thinking about, you know, what is the immediate future of AI. Let's just call it the next 2 years, 5 years.
Yeah, so it's a great question. So the most interesting thing that's happening, in my opinion, what they would call multimodal training. And multimodal training is when you take two modes of data input and you train them together in a single model. So the most famous example of this that came out recently is called DALL-E, D-A-L-L-E -2. It's the DALL-E 2 model from OpenAI. And what they did was they trained a bunch of images on the text description of those images, and they trained them together. When you do that, what you can do is, if I upload an image, you know, I upload a picture of this marker, and DALL-E 2 will spit out a description of this marker.
Okay.
Even cooler is I can upload some text like, you know, purple dry erase marker with a red cap or whatever. I mean, this doesn't have a red cap, but, and DALL-E will create that image from scratch, which is pretty cool. So when you think about the implications that has for content creation and automation, they're both amazing and terrifying. Like on the one hand, like, wow, how awesome is it as a business to be able to automate this process and create a lot more content that's useful for your customers and your prospects and all that. As a consumer, how terrible is it to think about it's easy for everybody to create ebooks and webinars and web paper, you know, whatever, white papers and whatever else. So that's something to think about. You know, and there's going to be some really interesting legal implications for some of this stuff. So I'll give an example of something that we're working on at Diantha. So one of the ways that consumer goods market themselves more and more frequently is influencers on Instagram. And to be honest, like these influencers, they're kind of a pain in the ass to deal with. A lot of them are prima donnas. They ask for way more money than they should. Yeah. And more importantly, they believe, those of us who are older know that like you're going to have your time and Instagram's going to die, and it's already like turned into TikTok, and it's going to be something else and something else every 7 years or whatever. Yep. And they think they're going to own the world forever, right? So like, how do you get around this and how do you scale this? AI technology for creating virtual humans is right on the cusp of feasible. So we have created some virtual influencer accounts, and we're 100% open that these are synthetic people, they're not real. But they gain followers because people want to follow a story. So rather than have to deal with influencers and negotiate and all this, we can have an intern who can manage 5 influencer accounts that we have and create pictures in an hour every day of things these influencers do and post them, and people follow along. They like the story, they engage with the influencers, and then every once in a while, we haven't started doing this yet because it's too new, but every once in a while we'll, you know, slide in one of the products that we make or have acquired. So you know, there's a whole bunch of legal implications, I think, around as all the virtual stuff starts getting more human-like. A really interesting example is if you're talking to a chatbot or you get a phone call and it's not a human, but it's indistinguishable from a human, do you have a right to know that? Should there be a law that tells you that you're dealing with a bot instead of a human? Should the bots have to register somewhere? Should the bots have to disclose that they're a bot? Like, you know, what if they're better than, what if they're more human-like than humans? Then do you care that it's a bot? Like, it's a fascinating thing to think about.
Yeah, that's wild. I never would have imagined that. But I mean, everything from, I mean, obviously like different types of legal implications that could be associated with that, but even just like, you know, sort of a social responsibility as well. You can see where you know, creation of content on social media has been, what for the last at least 6 years, probably closer to 10, has been a pretty hot button issue, globally, which is kind of crazy to think about. And I think it gives that like healthy, or it should give a reason for that healthy dose of skepticism that that I think most people would probably be pretty good to adopt. So let's talk a little bit about Dianthus. You've got a legal team there.
Yep.
Talk to me about, and you're relatively early. Like, we were talking before we kicked off here, and you've got under 200 people globally, right? And 70, I think you said 70 in North America, about 110 worldwide, somewhere in that neighborhood. That's right about the time for a first in-house counsel, but it seems like you've had your legal team in-house in place for a while. Tell me how you're thinking about, or how you were thinking about that legal team. What was the real driving force for you to bring in Counsel, and what were your expectations from that team as it started to build?
Yeah, well, any startup has a lot of legal issues to deal with. You have financings, you're raising money and all that. You have employee issues and options, and you have business contracts with other people. But on top of that, we have a lot of patent things that we're looking at. We've created some pretty novel technologies across a couple of areas, and then on top of it, we're acquiring a lot of small e-commerce companies that are $2 to $20 million in revenue, some as stock purchase agreements, some as asset purchase agreements. And so I quickly, like looking ahead, like a good founder should do, I realized that one of our biggest expenses, like our legal expenses, would blow up if we didn't have somebody to triage and help. So we hired a general counsel, was probably like our 12th employee.
Okay.
And so it's really challenging with to think about, like, lawyers don't normally join companies this small, and at the way we were when he came in. And so it's like, what do you need in some of that? And I think hiring lawyers for startups in-house is already tough because people that are drawn to law and study the law are not the first ones out the door to take a massive risk and start a company or join a company that's, like, particularly in the early days, like likely to fail. And and so I happen to know through a mutual friend a guy who named Michael Salmon, who was Harvard law grad, had left the law firm that he practiced at for many years. About maybe 8 years ago, he left to do a startup. Startup didn't work out, but he had that experience and he understood a lot of what it meant to work for a startup, which was very, very valuable. And then he had done some M&A law and had done investment banking before he went to law school. Okay. So for me, I'm like, perfect fit, and I already know the guy. Yeah. So I reached out to him, and he was pretty skeptical at first, but we convinced him to come, and he's doing a really great job. The thing about the founder tension with legal is, legal's always trying to minimize your risk. And I've had to have the conversation a lot of times. Like at my last startup, I was not very involved in the legal stuff because I was like, legal and accounting and finance, I would put all that off on somebody else. And so what happened is, like, we would spend a lot of money doing things like, we spent thousands of dollars to like rewrite our offer letter. And when I'm like, why are you doing this? And they're like, well, the law firm said it should look this way. And I was like, the law firm wrote our last one 2 years ago. Like, why do they want to rewrite it? Well, things have changed. And I'm like, aren't offer letters like legally non-binding in Massachusetts? Right. And they're like, well, yeah. And I'm like, then why do we need to spend this money, right? Like, having the conversation and getting people to think about, like, I'm okay to take this risk. And so the way that I like to work with lawyers is to explain to them, like, look, here's what I want to do. You tell, like, I don't like the lawyers to make recommendations to me of what we should do. And I particularly don't like it when they're like, really kind of like, some of the big law firms for startups really do is they kind of strong arm you into, like, look, you're going to do it this way, or like, we're going to work with somebody else. But I think the job is to lay out for me, like, what are the options of various risk levels? And then I, as the business leader, like, decide how much risk I want to take on, and what we might do. So let me give you an example of how that plays out at Dianthus. We, obviously, when you're acquiring small companies, there's a million things that could hit you on the back end, sales tax liability being the biggest one. But obviously lots of other, product liability and all these things. So the way we approached this said, look, let's just assume that we cannot draft a contract that will get us out of this 100%. And we need to move fast. So what do? We said, well, what's an acceptable error rate on a revenue basis? So if we're going to acquire $10 million worth of revenue a year via these acquisitions, and we are off by 3%, 5%, 7%, like the cost that comes back to burn us, what's the acceptable level for that in return for moving fast? And we determined we would start with 4% and we would see. And so, you know, on a risk-adjusted basis, we can tolerate 4% worth of mistakes financially, and
Right.
we think that's acceptable in terms for being able to like maybe move 2 weeks faster on getting a deal closed and not do the, you know, fine-tooth comb diligence that we might do otherwise. So yeah, so it's hard to find people that are comfortable with that, you know, and want to think about the world that way. But Michael's done a great job for us.
That's great to hear that you've got the right person in the right seat there. You know, it's definitely something that I've seen. So I've been fortunate enough to spend my entire career in-house. I haven't had to go through the torture of being in a law firm, thank goodness. But you know, one of the things that I've seen attorneys really struggle with is that transition from being a law firm lawyer to an in-house lawyer. And you know, some of it is training, right? Some of it is training where, you know, the law firm will give direction that needs to be of a certain level of risk tolerance. And what I've seen attorneys struggle with is understanding that the advice that's given is throttled through the lens of risk, as opposed to like these attorneys will say like, oh no, you can't do this, or like this is way too far. And it's like, it's unlikely that that's way too far. Like that's probably way too far for your law firm to be able to recommend that course of action and stand behind it. But it's absolutely nowhere near way too far for the entrepreneur to take that risk, right? And sometimes it's a risk that you have to take. And so I've seen attorneys really struggle with that. So listen, I know we're running up on time. We did get a couple of questions here, and we've got time for one or two here. Wanted to get this one for you. Advice. So you've hired and built teams, not just legal teams, but when you think about building your company, building the teams within the company, and even in your investments, when you've seen people who have been able to build really strong, high-performing teams, are there some common themes with those high-performing teams, or the ability to scale in that way that you've noticed? Or is there any advice that you can give to anybody who's building a team, whether it's a legal team or otherwise, that maybe you could help along with, and something you maybe wish that you knew 10 years ago, 15 years ago?
Yeah, so I have two lessons on hiring that I think are really important. The first comes from, if you've ever seen the movie Miracle about the 1980 hockey team, there's this scene where the coach, Herb Brooks, submits the list to the assistant coach and says, these are the players, and the guy looks at it and he says, Herb, you left some of the best players are still on the ice. And he says, I'm not looking for the best players, I'm looking for the best team. And one of the things that people really hone in on is they want to hire the best person all the time, but you have to think about team chemistry and what you need on a team. And, I mentioned earlier, I'm a Kentucky basketball fan. So, John Calipari has these great recruiting seasons every year and recruits a bunch of the best kids. Getting a bunch of number one recruits to play together is sometimes really hard. And the last time they won a championship, you know what they had? They had a couple of people that had been there for a while that weren't like going to turn into NBA superstars, but that were good team players and made everybody else work at it. So you got to think about the whole team dynamic and what you need on that team in different roles. And then the second thing is, and this helps with culture and diversity and everything else, but a lot of times if you think about a bell curve distribution of talent, your people that are on the far, far, far right, your people that are like the top 0.5% of 1% of performers, they often their resumes look like the people on the bottom, right?
Yeah.
They've been all over the place. They've done a whole bunch of things. And so you're like, okay, you either don't know what you're doing or you're a polymath who's bored by everything. You have to interview them to know. 7 out of 10 times, you're going to be like, I wasted my time. You're terrible. But sometimes you're going to be like, wow, these people are really interesting. So I make my teams interview 10% of the candidates should not meet the job description. And the reason that I do that is because, number one, it lets people sneak in who might be like bad at writing resumes. But like, you know, if you're like, I'm interviewing people, I got to pick 2 people that, you know, don't meet the standard. Who are the best 2 that don't meet the standard that at least might be interesting to talk to? Like, that's a good, you know, a good thing to pull in. And then, you know, and then the other thing about it is it makes sure the standard's right. Like, if you're saying you need 7 years experience, you got to be at an Ivy League school or whatever, and you're interviewing a couple of people that I've forced you to interview now that you're like, wow, they went to University of Wisconsin and they're amazing and I didn't think they would be. It's like you can recalibrate your hiring sometimes. So those would be my 2 pieces of feedback.
That's awesome. That's awesome. It's great advice. Rob, it was awesome to catch up. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this with us today. And really looking forward to having you by the office very, very soon here. So thanks again. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me, Tim.